Welcome. Settle in, let your body relax, and let the weight of the day fall away. Because tonight we are going somewhere extraordinary. Not to a place of peace, exactly, but to a place of consequence. To the edge of a world that was about to change forever. This is a sleep story, but it is also a history, and the best histories are the ones that feel alive, that feel urgent, even when they are centuries old. So let your eyes close, find your breath, and follow the sound of this voice back through time, across the Atlantic Ocean, down through the warm waters of the Caribbean, and onto a white sand coastline where a man is making a decision that will alter the course of human civilization. The year is 1519. The place is a stretch of beach on the eastern coast of what we now call Mexico. The air smells of salt and tropical wood, and something else. Something acrid and sharp, because there is smoke rising from the harbour. 11 ships are anchored in shallow water, and they are burning. Thick black columns curl upward into a sky so blue it almost seems indifferent. And the men on the beach are watching their only way home disappear into ash and ember. Some of them are in disbelief. Some of them are already furious. A few perhaps are afraid in the deep, wordless way that human beings are afraid when they realise there is no going back. And the man who ordered it, their commander, their leader, the one responsible for all of it, stands among them and watches the flames and says nothing. His name is Hernán Cortés, and he has just committed one of the most audacious, most debated, most psychologically extraordinary acts in the history of military command. He has destroyed his own ships. He has cut off his own retreat. He has told 500 men in the most literal way possible that the only direction left is forward. But this story is not just about a dramatic gesture on a beach. The story of Hernán Cortés and why he burned those ships reaches, back decades before that morning, into the narrow streets of a small Spanish town, into the courts of kings and the ambitions of governors, into the ancient politics of an empire in central Mexico that had been building for centuries. It reaches into the lives of women who became translators and diplomats, into the hearts of indigenous warriors who hated their Aztec overlords and saw in this strange pale-faced man a weapon they might use against them. It reaches into questions of loyalty, of betrayal, of madness and genius, and the terrifying distance between the two. And when we follow this story all the way to its end, we find something that still resonates, something that has echoed through centuries of military strategy and business philosophy and personal courage. The idea that sometimes the only way to commit fully to where you are going is to make it impossible to go back to where you came from. The ships are burning. There is nowhere to retreat. So you march. We will spend the next several hours moving through this story together, from the Spain that made Cortés to the Mexico that he would change forever, and that would change him too. We will meet the people who stood in his way, and the people who chose to stand beside him. We will walk through the streets of Tenochtitlan, one of the most spectacular cities on earth at that moment, a city built on a lake, a city of canals and floating gardens and temples that reach toward the sun. We will witness its fall, and we will try to understand what was lost and what was gained and what the burning of those ships really meant. So breathe out slowly. Let the world outside this moment grow quiet. The fires are beginning on the beach. The story is beginning, and once it starts, like those ships on the water, there is no going back. There is a particular quality to the way fire reflects on water at night. That orange and amber dance that turns the surface of the sea into something that looks almost alive, almost like it is thinking. And on the night those ships burned at Veracruz, the men who stood on the beach watching them were watching something more than the destruction of timber and canvas and rope. They were watching the last version of themselves, the version that could still go home, the version that was still a colonial adventure on an expedition that could be abandoned if it got too hard, the version that had an out, burn away into smoke and embers and then nothing. After that night they were different people. They were people without a return, and what that meant for what they were capable of, and what it meant for the world they were about to change, is a story that begins much earlier than that beach, and extends much further than any of them could have imagined standing there in the firelight. The story of the burning of the ships is also, in a deeper sense, a story about the nature of historical momentum, about how the great turning points in human history are never really single moments, but rather the visible crests of long waves that have been building beneath the surface for years, sometimes decades, before they break. Cortés on the beach in 1519 is the crest of a wave that began with the fall of Granada in 1492, with Columbus's first voyage that same year, with the encomienda system in the Caribbean, and the rumours of mainland wealth and the politics of a colonial bureaucracy that simultaneously created ambitious young men and frustrated them at every turn. The burning of the ships is the moment the wave breaks, but to understand why the wave broke, and why it broke exactly there and exactly then, and why it broke with that particular force and in that particular direction, you have to go back to where the water was still calm. To understand why Hernán Cortés made the choices he made, you have to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world that had been marinating in a very particular kind of hunger for the better, part of a century. That hunger had a name, or rather it had several names depending on who you asked. The church called it the propagation of the faith. The crown called it territorial expansion. The soldiers who crossed the Atlantic with nothing but a sword and a prayer called it fortune. But underneath all those names was a simpler, older, more universal thing. The desperate human desire to matter, to take a life that felt small and provincial, and make it large, to reach beyond the edge of the known world and come back transformed. Spain, in the late 15th century, was itself a country in the middle of transformation. For nearly 8 centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a patchwork of Christian kingdoms and Muslim-ruled territories, and the long process of the Reconquista, the reconquest of that peninsula by Christian forces, had been grinding forward and backward and sideways for generations. But in 1492, that process effectively concluded. The last Muslim kingdom of Granada fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who had united the crowns of Castile and Aragon through their marriage, and whose ambitions for their unified Spain had no clear ceiling. 1492 is a year that carries a lot of weight in history, and not just because of Columbus. That year, Ferdinand and Isabella also expelled the Jewish population from Spain, a catastrophic act of religious persecution that sent waves of people fleeing across the Mediterranean, and the combined effect of all these events was a country simultaneously exhausted from centuries of internal conflict and electric with the sense of a new era beginning. There was military energy with nowhere to go. There were young men trained from childhood to fight who suddenly had no obvious enemy left to fight on Spanish soil. And there was a monarchy that had very expensive tastes, ambitious foreign policies, and a deep curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. Then Columbus came back from his first voyage with gold and parrots and a handful of confused indigenous people, and everything changed. The ocean was not a wall, it was a road. And the question that every ambitious young man in Spain immediately began asking was, where does that road lead, and what can I bring back from it? The answer, at first, was the Caribbean. The islands that Columbus found, Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the rest, were absorbed into the Spanish colonial system with extraordinary speed and extraordinary brutality. The indigenous populations of those islands, the Taino people and others, were decimated by a combination of violence, forced labour, and the European diseases that swept through communities with no immunological history against them. Smallpox alone killed an estimated 90% of the native populations in the decades following contact. The Spanish who arrived in the Caribbean were not primarily settlers in the peaceful sense of that word. They were conquerors, and the encomienda system that they established was essentially a formalized version of slavery, in which indigenous people were assigned to Spanish landowners who were theoretically responsible for their Christian education, but practically interested only in their labor. Gold was the obsession, and gold was what drove the Spanish further and further into unfamiliar territory. The islands had some, but not enough. Never enough, and the rumours of vast wealth on the mainland, carried on the lips of traders and scouts and the occasional indigenous informant, kept pushing the horizon further west. By the time Hernán Cortés was a young man making his way in the Caribbean, the islands were already something of a disappointment compared to the dreams that had driven men across the ocean. Cuba had been settled in 1511. Hispaniola was already stratified and bureaucratic. For a man who wanted to make his name, who wanted to matter in the way that the songs and stories of the Reconquista had promised a man of valour could matter, the islands felt like a waiting room. Everyone sensed the real story was somewhere beyond. The society that governed this Caribbean world was a tense and complicated one, constantly negotiating between the ambitions of individual conquistadors and the interests of the Spanish crown, between men who wanted to act boldly and quickly and an administration that moved slowly and was deeply suspicious of anyone who grew too powerful too fast. The governor of Cuba was a man named Diego Velázquez de Cuellar, and he would become one of the most important forces in Cortés's life, first as a patron, then as an obstacle, then as a nemesis. Velázquez was not a fool. He was a capable administrator who had conquered Cuba efficiently, and who understood that the wealth of the Caribbean flowed through him and should continue to flow through him. What he was less comfortable with was men who didn't play by the rules, men whose ambition exceeded their station, men who might, given half a chance, go do something extraordinary and become famous for it without giving the governor his proper cut. Hernán Cortés was precisely that kind of man, and somewhere in the magnetic field between his outsized ambition and Velázquez's well-founded suspicion, the explosion that would change the world was already being prepared. The Spain that Cortés was born into was also a Spain deeply shaped by a culture of storytelling, about warriors and saints, and the conquest of the infidel, a culture in which the distinction between historical fact and inspiring legend was not always carefully maintained, and was not always considered particularly important to maintain. The chivalric romances, those enormously popular stories of knight-errantry and impossible deeds and love and honour and treasure, were the mass media of the age, the equivalent of the adventure films and action novels that perform a similar function in our own time, and they created in their readers a certain expectation about what a life of consequence should look like. A man of valour went out into the world and faced impossible odds, and performed extraordinary feats, and came back changed, ennobled, rewarded. The fact that real life rarely worked this way was not entirely dissuasive. The stories were real enough in the imagination to make the world they described seem attainable, if only you were brave enough or lucky enough or willing enough to reach for it. There is a broader economic story running beneath the surface of the Spanish colonial enterprise that is worth pausing on, because it helps explain the frantic, competitive, sometimes reckless quality of the conquest. The Spanish crown's finances in the early 16th century were in a state of chronic emergency. The cost of the Reconquista, the cost of maintaining military campaigns in Italy and North Africa, and elsewhere in Europe, the cost of a royal court that understood conspicuous wealth as a form of political communication, all of it created a structural dependency on new sources of revenue that the Americas offered and that the crown was correspondingly desperate to exploit. The men who went to the New World were not just pursuing personal ambition. They were, in a structural sense, being encouraged and in some cases compelled to operate at the violent edge of expansion, because the system that governed them needed the wealth that edge produced. Understanding this does not excuse what happened, but it helps explain the ferocity with which it happened. The Caribbean, by the time Cortés was preparing his expedition, had also developed a mythology of its own, a mythology of what lay just over the next horizon. Stories of a fountain of youth somewhere to the north drove expeditions into Florida. Stories of gold-rich cities called the Seven Cities of Gold drove men north and west into deserts. Stories of a kingdom ruled entirely by women, the Amazons of classical legend transplanted to the Americas, drove men south toward the great river that would eventually bear that name. The imagination of the age was, in the very precise sense, fertile ground for the impossible, and the rumours that came back from Juan de Grijalva's 1518 expedition, the gold ornaments, the sophisticated settlements, the evidence of a large and organised civilization, were not just information. They were, to men primed by a lifetime of chivalric romance and colonial mythology, nearly indistinguishable from the fulfilment of a prophecy. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in a small town called Medellín, in the region of Extremadura in western Spain. Extremadura is not a glamorous part of the country. It is dry and dusty in summer, cold and unforgiving in winter, a landscape of cork oaks and limestone hills that has historically produced people with a certain quality, stubborn, resourceful, and possessed of a restless energy that the landscape itself seems to encourage, as if the sparse beauty of it whispers constantly that there must be something more, somewhere else, worth going after. Francisco Pizarro came from Extremadura. Francisco de Orellana, who would eventually navigate the Amazon River, came from Extremadura. There is something in the lineage of that land and its people that seems to have been pointed, almost fatally, toward the far side of the world. Cortés's family was minor nobility, hidalgos as the Spanish called them, meaning literally son of something, people who could claim aristocratic blood but had very little actual wealth to show for it. His father, Martin Cortés de Monroy, was a cavalry officer who had fought in the wars of the Reconquista, and his mother was Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, a woman of similarly modest, noble descent. They were not peasants, but they were not powerful, and the combination of social ambition and insufficient means to fulfill it is one of history's most reliable engines of extraordinary behaviour. Young Hernán grew up knowing that he was supposed to be someone, without having been given the tools to become that someone in the conventional way. He was reportedly a sickly child, small and pale, and there are accounts, though historical accounts of childhood are always to be treated with some suspicion, that he was given to fevers and that his survival was considered uncertain at several points. Whether or not this is accurate, what is consistent across the sources is a portrait of someone who developed early a very fierce determination to prove himself, a quality that can emerge either from strength or from its opposite, and in Cortés seems to have emerged from both simultaneously. At 14, his parents sent him to the University of Salamanca, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe, with the intention that he study law. Salamanca would have been a revelation for a boy from Medellin, a city of students and scholars and ideas, of debating halls and libraries, of conversations about theology and Roman history and the New World opening up beyond the ocean. He spent 2 years there, apparently studying with reasonable diligence, before returning home without completing his degree. The reasons for this are unclear. Some accounts suggest he was simply too restless for academic life. Others hint at romantic entanglements or financial difficulties. What is consistent is that he came back from Salamanca with a legal mind. He could argue, he could write, he could navigate the complex bureaucratic language of official documents with unusual fluency, but also with a clear conviction that the life of a lawyer was not the life he wanted. He considered going to the Italian campaigns, where Spanish soldiers were fighting for territory in Naples. He considered several things, but in 1504, when he was 19 years old, he boarded a ship for Hispaniola, and the calculating, determined, occasionally ruthless intelligence that would one day burn a fleet of ships on a Mexican beach turned itself fully toward the New World. His first years in Hispaniola were not glorious. He was given land and indigenous labourers under the encomienda system, and he was in some ways a conventional colonist, acquiring cattle, growing crops, building the modest prosperity that a minor Spanish noble could build in the Caribbean if he was reasonably diligent. But he also got sick. A mysterious illness that some historians believe was syphilis kept him bedridden for extended periods and delayed the larger adventures he clearly had in mind. He was 20 years old and already behind schedule in his own imagination. When Diego Velázquez launched his conquest of Cuba in 1511, Cortés went along as a secretary and participated in the military campaign with enough distinction to earn Velázquez's notice. He was rewarded with land and labour, made the mayor of Santiago de Baracoa, Cuba's first capital, and began what appeared to be a comfortable administrative career under the governor's patronage. He charmed people easily, he was witty and engaging and could adjust his register depending on the company, as comfortable trading rough jokes with soldiers as composing careful letters for officials. He was also, by multiple accounts, extraordinarily persistent, the kind of man who simply did not take no for an answer and who had the patience to keep pushing toward what he wanted, long after a lesser man would have given up. His relationship with Velázquez was complicated from the start by the fact that Cortés kept, in the polite phrase, pushing the limits. He had a relationship with a woman named Catalina Suarez, one of several sisters who had come from Cuba and over whom the Velázquez extended family had a protective interest. Velázquez expected Cortés to marry her. Cortés delayed, and the resulting tension led to actual imprisonment. Velázquez had Cortés briefly jailed, which was not the kind of thing a man with Cortés's ego tended to forget or forgive. He escaped, was recaptured, and eventually did marry Catalina Suarez, though the marriage appears to have been unhappy. The incident established a pattern that would define their entire relationship. Velázquez held the power officially, but Cortés kept finding ways to slip through the cracks of it. By 1518, Cortés was in his early 30s, prosperous enough by Caribbean standards, but deeply aware that the islands were a closed chapter. The stories coming back from the mainland, from expeditions led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517 and Juan de Grijalva in 1518, were electric. There were cities, there was gold, there were people who wore clothes made of woven cotton and lived in stone buildings, and who seemed to be operating within some kind of sophisticated political and economic order. This was not the Caribbean. This was something else entirely. Cortés wanted the command of the next expedition more than he'd ever wanted anything. The Cortés who arrived in the Caribbean was already, by most accounts, possessed of a quality that is difficult to name but easy to recognize. A magnetic personal authority that had little to do with his formal position or his physical size and everything to do with the way he carried himself in a room, the way he listened and then responded, the way he made decisions and then stood behind them. Soldiers who served under him, even those who disagreed with his choices or resented his authority, consistently describe him in terms that suggest someone who generated confidence in others, who made the men around him feel that the situation, however dire, was being managed by someone who understood it. This is a quality that can be taught to a limited degree but is mostly either present or absent, and in Cortés it was fully present from an early age. He was also a man of considerable physical courage, which matters in a world where leaders were expected to be visible in battle, where the man who commanded troops was also the man who stood at the front of the line. He was wounded multiple times during the campaign in Mexico, continued to command under conditions that would have justified most men stepping back, and repeatedly placed himself in the point of maximum danger when he judged that his presence there would be strategically decisive. This was not merely recklessness. He calculated his moments carefully, understanding intuitively that there were times when the sight of the commander leading the charge was worth 10 times its tactical value in psychological terms, both to his own men and to the enemy. But there is another quality in Cortés that the heroic narrative of the conquest sometimes loses: his capacity for cruelty, and more specifically for strategic cruelty. The Cholula massacre, whatever its exact circumstances, was followed by a careful communication strategy in which Cortés made sure that the story of what happened spread as widely as possible through the Mexican political world. He wanted people to know. He wanted the rulers and the armies between him and Tenochtitlan to understand that the Spanish were not simply another group of armed traders who might be managed and manipulated and eventually sent home. He was deliberately cultivating a reputation for violence that would do psychological work in advance of his physical arrival, softening resistance before it could organize, making the calculation of fighting him seem more costly than the calculation of accommodation. It worked, to a significant extent, and it worked because Cortés was willing to do things that a man with a stronger conscience might have refused to do. The legal and bureaucratic mind that Salamanca had given him, combined with the ruthlessness that the colonial environment had cultivated, produced a man who was capable of constructing arguments that justified almost anything he wanted to do. He could find the legal framework, the moral reasoning, the procedural cover for any act he had already decided to commit. This made him extraordinarily effective in the circumstances of the conquest, where the rules were genuinely uncertain, and the man who could define the rules fastest had an enormous advantage. It also made him, from the perspective of his superiors in the colonial hierarchy, deeply unsettling to deal with. He was always one carefully worded letter away from turning any accusation into an argument for his own sainthood. The politics of who would lead the expedition to the Mexican mainland were messy from the beginning, and the mess had its roots in the essential tension that defined life in the Spanish colonies, the tension between ambition and authority, between men who wanted to act and institutions that wanted to control them. Diego Velázquez, as governor of Cuba, had the authority to commission expeditions and to appoint their leaders, and he had initially leaned toward more experienced commanders. But both the Hernández de Córdoba and the Grijalva expeditions had returned without having actually established a Spanish foothold on the mainland, and Velázquez was frustrated. He wanted someone who would go not just to explore but to colonize, to establish permanent presence, to send back treasure. The people around Velázquez who had Cortés's ear began making the case for him. Cortés himself worked his connections with almost surgical precision, cultivating allies among the governor's circle, making himself indispensable and agreeable, projecting exactly the combination of capability and deference that was most likely to win the appointment. And it worked. In October of 1518, Diego Velázquez formally gave Hernán Cortés the commission to lead the next expedition to the Mexican coast. Cortés immediately threw himself into preparation with an energy that should have told Velázquez something important about what he was actually dealing with. The speed with which Cortés moved was dazzling and alarming in equal measure. Within weeks he had recruited hundreds of soldiers, acquired ships, gathered supplies, enlisted sailors and craftsmen, and began the process of outfitting what was rapidly becoming not an exploratory venture but a military campaign. He used his own money, borrowed heavily, mortgaged everything he had. He ran through the capital he had spent 14 years accumulating in the Caribbean in a matter of months. This was not the behaviour of a man planning a cautious reconnaissance mission. This was the behaviour of a man who had decided that this expedition was his one shot at the life he had always imagined, and who was willing to bet everything on it. Velázquez watched all of this and grew increasingly nervous. The expedition he had commissioned was beginning to look larger than the authority he had granted, and Cortés's behaviour, the recruiting, the fundraising, the obvious enthusiasm, was starting to feel less like a servant executing his master's commission, and more like a rival building his own power base. Rumours reached Velázquez that Cortés was planning not just to explore, but to conquer, and to conquer not in Velázquez's name but in his own. The governor's advisers began whispering that this had been a mistake, that Cortés was too ambitious, that the commission should be revoked before it was too late. The debate among Velázquez's inner circle was itself a small drama of competing interests and personalities. There were men who had befriended Cortés and argued for him. There were others who had always been jealous of his rapid rise and who now saw their chance to bring him down. Velázquez himself vacillated, as powerful men sometimes do when they are confronted with evidence that they have made an error of judgment, but have not yet decided what to do about it. He delayed, he consulted, he worried, and Cortés, sensing the weather change before the rain came, decided not to wait for the storm. In November of 1518 he accelerated everything. He pulled his fleet together at Santiago de Cuba and prepared to depart ahead of the commission that was being assembled to revoke his authority. There are accounts that he was in the process of slaughtering cattle to provision the ships when Velázquez's men arrived at the docks to tell him his commission was suspended. Cortés, from the deck of his ship, reportedly engaged in some polite conversation with the governor himself, who had come personally to the waterfront, and then simply left. He sailed out of Santiago harbour with the official command that had given him his position already technically in the process of being withdrawn. From that moment forward, Cortés was operating in a legal and political limbo. He had a commission from Velázquez, but Velázquez had tried to revoke it. He was therefore either the legitimate leader of a lawful Spanish expedition or a rogue operator who had defied his governor and would be arrested if he returned to Cuba. The ambiguity of this position would haunt him for years. Velázquez would spend enormous energy trying to have him arrested, tried, and executed, dispatching his own agent with a competing army to pursue Cortés into Mexico even as the conquest was unfolding. But in those first weeks after sailing away from Santiago, the ambiguity was also, in a strange way, liberating. Cortés had already defied authority. There was already a price attached to going back. The logic of commitment of having already burned part of the bridge behind him was already operating. He stopped along the Cuban coast to continue recruiting and supplying. He made a stop at Trinidad where he added several hundred more men, including veterans of previous Caribbean campaigns who understood what the mainland might offer. He sent letters, carefully composed, legally sophisticated letters, to the Spanish crown explaining his actions, justifying his defiance of Velázquez, and positioning himself as a loyal servant of the king who had been forced by circumstances to act outside the conventional chain of command. The law training from Salamanca proved its worth here. Cortés understood that the way to survive his insubordination was to argue it was not insubordination at all, but a higher form of loyalty. When the fleet finally left Cuban waters in February of 1519, it carried roughly 500 soldiers, some sailors and craftsmen, a handful of priests, approximately 16, horses, and 14 artillery pieces. The horses matter. In a world that had never seen a horse, the psychological impact of a mounted warrior was incalculable, and Cortés understood this with remarkable strategic clarity. He also carried with him the accumulated political danger of his situation. A governor who wanted him arrested, a legal status that was genuinely unclear, and the full knowledge that if he failed, if he came back with nothing, or if Velázquez's people reached the crown before he did, there was nothing waiting for him but disgrace and prison. The fleet cleared the Cuban coast and turned west into open water, and the weight of it all settled over the expedition like the first breath of a storm. They were going. Whatever happened next would happen in a world that had no maps. The men who joined the expedition to Mexico were not a homogeneous group, and understanding the variety of motivations and backgrounds they brought with them helps explain both the expedition's cohesion under pressure and its occasional fractures. There were veterans of the Italian campaigns, experienced soldiers who had fought for Spain on European battlefields, and who brought genuine military professionalism to the enterprise. There were younger men, barely out of adolescence, who had come to the Caribbean chasing adventure and fortune, and had found, in the colonial islands, something that felt too settled and too small. There were craftsmen and artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, surgeons, priests, whose skills would prove as essential to the campaign's success as any military training, and there were a handful of Africans, both free and enslaved, whose presence in the expedition tends to be under-acknowledged in the traditional narratives, but whose contributions, including in a few documented cases acts of considerable military bravery, were real. The ships themselves tell a story worth attending to. They were not purpose-built warships. They were the vessels of Caribbean commerce adapted for the expedition, caravels and brigantines and smaller craft, repaired and provisioned with whatever Cortés and his backers could acquire. The process of fitting them out had consumed the better part of several months and essentially all of the financial capital that Cortés had accumulated in 14 years in the Caribbean. He had borrowed against future plunder that didn't yet exist, a form of leveraged optimism that characterizes the most committed kind of gambler. When the ships finally left Cuban waters, they carried not just soldiers and weapons, but the entire material wager of his adult life. The burning of those ships, a year later, would be the destruction of assets that had never been fully paid for, a detail that somehow makes the gesture even more complete. The coast of what we now call Mexico emerged from the sea like a dream that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be. Hernán Cortés and his fleet began working their way, along the Yucatán Peninsula and then northward along the Gulf Coast in early 1519, and the world they encountered was unlike anything any of them had seen in the Caribbean. The vegetation was different, denser, more varied, pressing right up to the edge of the sand in a way that felt alive and deliberate, as if the jungle were considering whether to advance or retreat. The settlements they saw from the ships were larger and more structured than anything on the islands, and the people who came to meet them or watch them from a distance were clearly part of something organised, something with hierarchy and ceremony and the unmistakable quality of a civilization that had been building itself for a very long time. At Cozumel Island, early in the expedition, Cortés made a discovery that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire enterprise. Among the Maya-speaking populations of the coast, he found a Spanish man named Jerónimo de Aguilar who had been shipwrecked 8 years earlier and had lived among the Maya long enough to speak their language with reasonable fluency. Aguilar was in a state of some psychological complexity after 8 years of captivity and gradual integration into indigenous society. His companion in captivity, another Spaniard named Gonzalo Guerrero, had in fact refused to return with Cortés, having married a Maya noblewoman, tattooed his face, and by his own account gone fully native, becoming a military advisor to local chiefs. Guerrero's choice was one of those moments that history tends to fold away and not examine too carefully, because it complicates the narrative in interesting ways. Here was a European who looked at the indigenous civilization and chose it over his own. Aguilar chose differently and rejoined the Spanish expedition, becoming a translator. His arrival was significant, but what came next was more significant still. At Tabasco, on the Gulf Coast, Cortés engaged in his first real military encounter with the people of the mainland. The Tabascans initially refused to allow the Spanish to trade or resupply, and after a brief conflict in which the Spanish guns and horses caused exactly the confusion and terror Cortés had anticipated, the Tabascans offered gifts to settle the peace. Among those gifts were 20 women, intended as household servants and translators, and the various roles that such transactions had historically encoded. One of those women would become the most important individual in the entire conquest of Mexico. Her name, in the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, was Malinali, and she came to be known as La Malinche, or Doña Marina, in the Spanish records, and the story of who she was and what she did and what it meant is one of the most extraordinary and contested narratives in Mexican history. She was a Nahua-speaking noblewoman who had been sold into slavery. The details are murky, involving the death of her father, a remarriage, and a stepfather's decision to remove her from the family line, and she had been living among the Tabascans long enough to have learned their Mayan dialect. So when she was given to Cortés, she already knew two languages: Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire, and Mayan, the language of the Gulf Coast. With Aguilar's Spanish to Mayan translation added to her Mayan to Nahuatl ability, the expedition suddenly had a communication chain that could reach directly into the heart of the Aztec world. But La Malinche was far more than a linguistic conduit. The accounts, both Spanish and indigenous, consistently portray her as someone of extraordinary intelligence, political acumen, and interpretive skill. Someone who understood not just the words but the subtexts, the status signals, the diplomatic protocols, the unspoken negotiations that ran beneath every formal encounter. She understood the Aztec political system well enough to explain to Cortés the network of tensions and grievances that ran through the empire, the way that Moctezuma's authority sat uneasily on top of peoples who had been conquered and taxed and sacrificed, and who harboured deep resentments about all of it. She was, in other words, not just translating language but translating worlds, and without her the expedition that Cortés was running would have been blind. The Mexican political landscape that La Malinche helped Cortés see was vastly more complex than the Caribbean colonies had prepared any of them for. The Aztec Empire, more precisely the triple alliance of the city-states of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, dominated central Mexico from its capital at Tenochtitlan, the great city on the lake that Cortés had not yet seen but was already hearing about. The empire's reach was extensive, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from the dry northern plateaus to the humid southern jungles, and it extracted tribute from dozens of subject peoples with a ruthless efficiency. The tribute took the form of food and cloth and cacao and gold and jade and, crucially, human beings. Thousands of captives taken in formalized military campaigns called flower wars, captured not for territory, but for the specific purpose of being taken back to Tenochtitlan and sacrificed to the gods at the great temple at the center of the city. The practice of human sacrifice is one of those historical facts that tends to get used either as an excuse for what the Spanish did, as if conquest and genocide could be justified by the practices of the conquered, or pushed aside in an attempt to avoid that justification. The truth is more complicated. The scale of Aztec sacrifice was real and large by any measure. The estimates vary widely, from a few thousand to tens of thousands of sacrifices per year, but whatever the precise number, it was enough that the subject peoples of the empire knew exactly what their tribute in human flesh meant and felt about it with a specificity that Cortés was immediately alert to exploiting. The empire's greatest vulnerability was not its military. The Aztec warriors were formidable and experienced, but the volcanic resentment of the peoples it had subjugated. Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico not as a conquering army of 500 strangers, but as a potential ally against a common enemy, and La Malinche helped him understand how to play that card. He was also, almost certainly, playing with another card whose meaning we can now assess from a distance that his contemporaries could not: timing. The year 1519 was, in the cyclical calendar of the Aztec world, associated with the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who, in certain versions of the mythology, had sailed away to the east centuries ago and promised to return. Cortés was arriving from the east, pale-skinned, and commanding what appeared from a distance to be sea-going mountains. Whether or not Moctezuma genuinely believed for even a moment that this figure might be the returning god is a question historians have debated for decades, and the answer is probably that the situation was more ambiguous than either the credulous version or the dismissive version suggests. But the legend existed, and Cortés was not above letting it do some work for him. The first extended conversations between Cortés and the coastal peoples, mediated through the chain of Aguilar and La Malinche, revealed almost immediately the depth of the resentment that ran through the political structure of the Aztec Empire. The coastal Totonacs, one of the peoples who lived under Aztec domination in the Gulf Coast region, were almost desperate in their eagerness to find an ally who might help them throw off the tribute burden. The Aztec tax collectors who came periodically to extract gold and cloth and food and young people for sacrifice were so universally hated that the mention of them was enough to darken any room. Cortés listened carefully to all of this through La Malinche's translation, and began to understand something that would become central to his entire strategy. The Aztec Empire was not a unified state in the way that Spain was a unified state. It was a structure of domination built on terror and tribute, and the peoples it held were waiting, not necessarily patiently, for a reason to resist. The story of La Malinche's early life, insofar as we can reconstruct it from the fragmentary indigenous and Spanish sources that have survived, is a story of a particular kind of resilience. The resilience of someone who has learned, through experience, that no child should have to accumulate, that survival depends on adaptation, on the ability to read the room and respond to what the room requires. She had been separated from her Nahua community, sold south to the Tabascans, absorbed into a culture whose language she had to learn from scratch. The skills of rapid linguistic acquisition and social reading that this history demanded of her were exactly the skills that made her invaluable at the moment when two civilizations collided, and there is something both remarkable and terrible about the fact that the catastrophe of her childhood produced exactly the instrument that the conquest required. The Aztec political system that La Malinche helped Cortés navigate was, in some ways, more similar to the systems of the ancient Mediterranean world than to anything in contemporary European experience. A tribute empire rather than a territorial one, in which conquered peoples kept their own rulers and cultures, and were required only to provide specific flows of wealth and labour and sacrificial victims to the centre. The sophistication of this system was real. It allowed the Aztec Triple Alliance to exercise authority over a vast and varied territory without the overhead of direct administration, but it also meant that the loyalty of subject peoples was always conditional, always negotiable, always potentially available to anyone who offered a better deal. Cortés was offering, if not freedom exactly, then at least a different kind of domination, and for some peoples the prospect of exchanging the known devils of Aztec rule for the unknown qualities of Spanish rule was a trade worth considering. Before Cortés could even contemplate the march to Tenochtitlan, he needed a base, a legal standing, and, most urgently, allies. The base he created by founding the settlement of Villarrica de la Vera Cruz on the Gulf Coast, which is significant not just as a practical matter but as a legal one. By establishing a municipality, complete with a town council, Cortés performed an elegant piece of political theatre. The council he installed then formally gave him his command, not from Velázquez but directly from the King of Spain, bypassing the governor of Cuba entirely. It was legally questionable, many would argue legally fraudulent, but it was clever, and it reflected the same kind of creative lawyering that had characterized his departure from Cuba. He was building the case, document by document, for his own legitimacy. The first real test of military force came not from the Aztecs, but from the Tlaxcalans, and it was a test that nearly ended the expedition before it had truly begun. The Tlaxcalteca were a confederation of city-states whose territory lay directly between the Gulf Coast and Tenochtitlan, and they had maintained their independence from the Aztec Empire through a combination of fierce military resistance and the Empire's peculiar decision to preserve them as a nearby source of captives for the Flower Wars rather than simply subjugate them outright. This made them enemies of the Aztecs and also, in theory, potential allies of anyone who wanted to move against Tenochtitlan. But they had no particular reason to assume the Spanish would be useful friends, and their first response to Cortés's approach was military resistance. The battles against the Tlaxcalans in late summer of 1519 were among the hardest fights the expedition would face in the entire campaign, and they tested the Spanish in ways the Caribbean battles had not. The Tlaxcalan warriors were not frightened by horses or guns as the less experienced coastal peoples had been. They were veterans of decades of warfare against the Aztecs, and they fought with a tactical sophistication that included overwhelming numbers, night attacks, feints, and coordinated maneuvers that clearly reflected serious military organization. In one engagement, an advanced scouting party led by Pedro de Alvarado, one of Cortés's lieutenants, a violent and impulsive man who would cause enormous problems later, was nearly annihilated. Another engagement saw the Spanish fighting through the night against wave after wave of warriors, the arquebus shot and crossbow bolts exhausted, the horses weary, the men running on fear and adrenaline. Cortés himself was wounded in several of these engagements, and the journal entries and letters from this period carry a quality of genuine exhaustion that the more triumphalist accounts of the conquest sometimes smooth over. These were 500 men in a foreign country with no reliable supply line, no guarantee of reinforcement, and an enemy that significantly outnumbered them and had the advantage of fighting on home ground. The survival of the expedition at this stage was not a foregone conclusion. What saved it was a combination of Spanish military technology, Cortés' tactical intelligence, and the Tlaxcalans' own calculation of their interests. The horses and guns did matter, not because they were invincible, but because they created a psychological edge in particular moments, and Cortés was very good at making sure those moments came at psychologically crucial times. He was also learning the Mesoamerican way of war as he went, observing the rituals and conventions that governed indigenous combat, the tendency to fight to capture rather than to kill, the significance of specific individuals and specific symbols in determining the morale of an engagement. He learned, for example, that killing or capturing an enemy leader often ended a battle more decisively than any amount of general slaughter. But the breakthrough came through diplomacy as much as through combat. The Tlaxcalan leaders, facing continued Spanish military resilience that they had not anticipated and aware that the political situation with the Aztecs was only becoming more complicated, eventually sent envoys to open negotiations. What followed was one of the most consequential diplomatic conversations of the entire conquest, mediated entirely by La Malinche. The Tlaxcalans agreed to become allies of Cortés. They would provide warriors, supplies, intelligence, and logistical support for the march to Tenochtitlan. In exchange, they were promised, and Cortés with some difficulty would eventually deliver, liberation from Aztec domination. The alliance with Tlaxcala fundamentally changed the nature of the expedition. What had arrived on the Mexican coast as a small Spanish force was now, effectively, the military command structure of a coalition, and the coalition included some of the most experienced anti-Aztec fighters in Mexico. The march that would eventually reach Tenochtitlan would carry thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors alongside the Spanish soldiers, and in numerical terms the Spanish were always the minority partner in this enterprise. This is one of the central facts about the conquest of Mexico that the conventional narrative tends to understate. It was not primarily a conquest by Europeans of Americans. It was a civil war within a crumbling empire in which one faction of indigenous Mexicans used European technology, Spanish organizational capacity, and an extraordinary moment of political vulnerability to pull down the Aztec state. Cortés was the catalyst and the commander, but the conquest was only possible because the peoples of Mexico made it possible. The march inland from Tlaxcala toward Tenochtitlan passed through a landscape of increasing political density and cultural complexity. At Cholula, one of the largest cities in Mexico at the time, with a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people, there was a crisis. Whether what happened there was a genuine ambush that Cortés preempted, as the Spanish accounts maintain, or a massacre of unarmed civilians, as some indigenous accounts suggest, or some complicated combination of both, the Cholula incident became one of the most debated events of the conquest. What is certain is that a very large number of Cholulan nobles and warriors died in a concentrated period, that the city was shaken to its foundations, and that the story spread through Mexico like smoke, reaching Tenochtitlan long before Cortés did, and adding a layer of terrifying uncertainty to the calculations that Moctezuma was already struggling to make, and then the mountains. The expedition climbed out of the warm lowlands and up through pine forests and past the snow-capped volcanoes that ring the Valley of Mexico, those enormous peaks called Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the Smoking Mountain and the Sleeping Woman, whose eruptions and centuries-long silence had been woven into the mythology of the people below. The Spanish climbed between them, through passes at altitude in cold that their tropical-adapted bodies struggled with, and when they reached the top of the pass and looked down into the Valley of Mexico for the first time, what they saw stopped the entire march in its tracks. Below them, spread across a high plateau ringed by mountains, was a lake, and in the lake, connected to the shore by long causeways that, even from this distance, looked like the fingers of an enormous hand, was a city. The route that Cortés chose for the march inland was not simply the most direct path to Tenochtitlan. It was a route calculated to maximize political intelligence, to move through as much of the political landscape as possible, making contacts, assessing alignments, gathering information about the state of opinion toward the Aztecs throughout central Mexico. He stopped at every significant town, held meetings with every available official, and through La Malinche conducted what amounted to a continuous diplomatic canvass of the region. He was building a picture of the empire's internal fault lines that would prove as strategically valuable as any military intelligence. The Tlaxcalan warriors who eventually joined the expedition were not a disorganized rabble of angry tributaries. They were the veterans of what amounted to a permanent war with the Aztec Empire, men who'd been fighting since adolescence, who knew the terrain of central Mexico intimately, who understood the tactics and the psychology of Aztec warfare with a precision that the Spanish could only approximate. Their military culture valued individual bravery and tactical skill in ways that were not entirely unlike the Spanish military tradition, and when the two cultures of warfare were combined, Spanish long-range weapons and cavalry, complementing Tlaxcalan close-quarters expertise and numerical strength, the result was a military coalition that was more effective than either component would have been alone. The physical journey from the coast to the Valley of Mexico was itself a feat of endurance that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The army moved through a vertical range of elevation that went from sea level to over 10,000 feet at the mountain passes, through climate zones that shifted from tropical heat to alpine cold within the span of a few days' march. The horses, the artillery, the thousands of indigenous porters carrying supplies, the wounded from the Tlaxcalan battles, all of it moved through terrain that was designed by geography to resist exactly this kind of military movement. The logistics of feeding and watering such a force in a country where the supply chain was essentially whatever could be extracted from local communities was a constant improvisation, a daily crisis that had to be managed alongside the military and political crises that kept arriving with their own urgency. The encounter with Cholula was a moment that crystallized the moral ambiguity at the heart of the conquest in a way that is still difficult to look at directly. Cholula was one of the great sacred cities of Mesoamerica, a pilgrimage destination, home to one of the largest pyramids in the world by volume, a place of deep spiritual significance for peoples across the region. Whatever happened there in October of 1519, the result was a massive act of violence against people in a sacred space, and the political use that Cortés made of it, the deliberate spreading of the story to maximize its terrifying effect on the region's political calculations, tells us something important about the relationship between the man's military genius and his moral imagination. He was capable of using suffering as a communications medium, and he did so with a pragmatism that has no comfortable way to be admired. We need to go back, because the march to Tenochtitlan that we have just been following actually began with a decision that Cortés made months earlier, while still on the coast, before the battles with the Tlaxcalans, before the alliance, before the mountains. The burning of the ships, the act that gives this entire story its most resonant image, happened at Veracruz in August of 1519, and to understand why it happened, you have to understand the very specific crisis that Cortés was facing at that moment. The crisis had a name, Francisco de Garay, or more precisely the memory of Francisco de Garay, and a larger problem that his name represented. Garay was a governor of Jamaica who had sent his own expedition to the Mexican coast, and the legal question of whether Cortés's commission from Velázquez overlapped with or superseded Garay's authority was genuinely unresolved. But the more immediate problem was internal. Among the men Cortés had recruited, the several hundred, soldiers who had crossed the Gulf of Mexico and were now camped on the coast of a strange country, fighting skirmishes with unfamiliar peoples, far from home, far from Cuba, far from anything familiar, there were men who were having second thoughts. These were not all cowards. Many of them were experienced soldiers who had made their calculation about this expedition based on the information available in Cuba, and the information available in Cuba had suggested an exploratory trading venture, not a full-scale war of conquest against what was clearly an enormous and well-organized empire. As the scale of what Cortés actually had in mind became clearer, as it became apparent that he was not planning to return to Cuba laden with gold after a brief reconnaissance, but rather to push deep into the interior and challenge the power of the most formidable empire in Mesoamerica, some of those men began quietly suggesting that perhaps they should reconsider. Perhaps they should go home. Perhaps the governor of Cuba had been right to revoke the commission. Perhaps there was a version of this where they turned around, went back to their farms and their encomiendas and their comfortable Caribbean lives, and let someone else carry the weight of this particular ambition. The pro-Cuba faction was not trivial. There were enough men inclined toward retreat to make Cortés's situation genuinely precarious, because an expedition without the confidence of its own soldiers is not really an expedition at all. And Cortés knew that Velázquez had not given up. He would later learn that the governor was already petitioning the crown for authority to have him arrested. and that an actual military force was being assembled in Cuba to pursue him. If even a fraction of his men decided to sail back, they would take the legal pretext for his authority with them. They would report directly to Velázquez, and the mission would be over. So he made the decision. But what exactly was the decision? This is where the historical record gets interesting, because the burning of the ships, the image of 11 vessels going up in flames while the army watches from the beach, is in some ways a simplification of what actually happened, a dramatic crystallization of a more complicated series of events. The most thorough accounts, including the famous one by Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who was present and who wrote the most detailed eyewitness account of the conquest decades later, suggest that Cortés first had the ships inspected by men he trusted and then announced, based on those inspections, that the ships were no longer seaworthy. They were riddled with shipworms, the termites of the sea, the teredo worms that consumed wooden hulls in tropical waters with merciless efficiency. They needed to be scuttled. This is technically plausible. Tropical shipworm damage was a genuine and serious problem for wooden ships in those waters, and Cortés was not wrong that ships left long at anchor in a Gulf Coast harbour would deteriorate rapidly. But the inspections were conducted by men Cortés had selected. The timing was suspiciously convenient, and the conclusion that all the ships were simultaneously too damaged to sail stretched coincidence to its limit. The men who wanted to return to Cuba did not believe it was an accident. They believed correctly that they had been managed, that Cortés had found the most defensible version of a decision he had already made, wrapped it in the language of practical necessity, and presented them with a fait accompli. Some accounts say he saved one ship, a small vessel that was technically preserved, though conveniently far from any port at the time. Other accounts compress the narrative into a single dramatic act of deliberate immolation. Bernal Díaz, who was there, is honest about the ambiguity. The men knew what was happening and why, and they were not entirely happy about it, but the argument that Cortés made, that leaving ships at anchor was a risk, that men would always be tempted to desert, that the equipment and personnel from the ships could be usefully redeployed on land, was not entirely without merit. He was also, reportedly, willing to lead those who wanted to return back to the coast himself and let them go, which was the kind of theatrical gesture that simultaneously offered the discontented an exit, and dared them to take it in front of their comrades. Very few took it. The social pressure of being the man who chose Cuba over glory, who chose safety over the extraordinary thing that was beginning to seem possible, was enormous in a military culture that valued honour and courage above almost everything else. And Cortés knew how to apply that pressure without appearing to apply it, which is one of the defining characteristics of a skilled commander. He did not bully his men into compliance. He constructed the situation so that compliance was the most natural choice, the choice that felt like their own. But the psychological logic that Cortés was applying that day on the coast of Veracruz was not merely tactical. It was also, in a strange way, deeply personal. The same logic that made it useful to strand his men was also the logic by which Cortés had been operating his entire adult life. He was always burning ships. He had burned the ship of his legal standing by defying Velázquez. He had burned the ship of his financial security by spending everything on the expedition. He had burned the ship of his safe career as a colonial administrator by pursuing this impossible gamble. The drama on the beach was the outward expression of something that had been happening in his mind since at least 1518, maybe since Salamanca, maybe since Medellin, maybe since the moment some young man who felt small in the Spanish countryside looked at the ocean and decided it was a road and not a wall. The effect on the army was exactly what he intended. Men who might have spent the months ahead calculating the distance to the coast and the chances of getting to a ship and sailing home now had no such calculation to make. The energy that goes into maintaining an exit strategy, the constant mental monitoring of the conditions under which retreat becomes justifiable, was suddenly unavailable to them. There was nothing to do but go forward, and when the only direction is forward, human beings discover reserves of courage and resourcefulness and commitment that the option of retreat had been quietly suppressing. This is the real genius of the burning of the ships, and it is why the story has echoed through centuries of military and strategic thought. It is not simply a story about removing the option of retreat. It is a story about what happens to human psychology when the option of retreat is removed, what becomes possible, what becomes thinkable, what becomes achievable, when the mind can no longer devote any of its energy to the question of whether to continue? The answer, as history would demonstrate over the next 2 years, was almost everything. The army broke camp the next morning, turned its back on the sea and began to march. The question of what exactly burned on the beach at Veracruz has exercised historians for centuries because the answer matters for how we interpret the act. If Cortés genuinely burned all his ships in a single dramatic gesture, the story is one of pure theatrical boldness, the commander who made retreat literally impossible by destroying the means of it. If he staged a more gradual process of scuttling and stripping, announcing it as a practical necessity, while managing the perception of each step, the story is more interesting in a different way. A leader who understood that the theatre of commitment can be as powerful as the fact of it, who manufactured a moment of irreversibility and managed the narrative around it with political sophistication. Bernal, Díaz del Castillo's account is the most detailed and the most credible, written by a man who was present and who had no particular interest in making Cortés look either more heroic or more cynical than he actually was. Díaz describes a process in which the ships were inspected, declared unsound, stripped of everything useful, iron fittings, sails, ropes, anchors, any hardware that could be repurposed on land, and then either beached or sunk. He notes that the men understood what was happening, that some were unhappy about it, and that Cortés addressed them in terms that emphasized the practical logic, while also invoking the language of honor and fortune. It was not a surprise announcement. It was a managed process with a clear political objective. The speech that Cortés reportedly gave to his men at Veracruz, preserved in various versions of varying reliability, is one of those historical speeches that probably wasn't delivered exactly as recorded, but that captures something real about the moment and the man. The versions we have emphasize several themes: the impracticality of leaving ships on a hostile coast where they could be captured or sabotaged, the better use of the sailors and equipment on land, the honours and wealth that lay ahead, and the simple, blunt fact that the men who were here were the men who would do this thing, because there was no one else, and there was no going back, and therefore the only rational position was full commitment to what lay ahead. The speech, in its various forms, is less remarkable for its rhetoric than for the clarity of its underlying logic. He was not asking his men to be brave. He was building a situation in which bravery was the only rational option available. There is a philosophical tradition, traceable from the Stoics through the Renaissance to the present day, that has something important to say about this kind of decision. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, of imagining the worst, outcome not to become paralyzed by fear of it, but to become familiar with it, to reduce its power over you, is in some ways the mental equivalent of what Cortés did physically. He didn't imagine going home, he made going home impossible. And in doing so, he eliminated the worst kind of fear, not the fear of death or injury, which soldiers can be trained to accept, but the fear of the decision itself, the constant second-guessing that comes from knowing you could still make a different choice. That second-guessing was gone. The decision had been made in iron and fire, and what remained was only action. The effect on the men was, by Bernal Díaz's account, exactly what Cortés intended. After the initial shock and anger, something settled. The men who had been calculating the conditions under which retreat would be justified found that the calculation had been taken away from them, and in its place was a kind of clarity. This was what they were doing. There was nothing else. And, with that acceptance came, gradually, a different quality of attention. Not the distracted, half-committed attention of men with one eye on the exit, but the focused, fully present attention of men who have accepted that the exit's gone, and who are, therefore, entirely here. The first sight of Tenochtitlan from the mountain pass is described by the Spanish soldiers who witnessed it in terms that reach, repeatedly and without embarrassment, for the word miracle. Bernal Díaz, whose rough and honest prose is one of our most valuable windows into the expedition, writes that they stood and stared and could not believe what they were seeing, that some of them said it must be a dream, that the great temple towers and the causeways and the density and scale of everything before them seemed to belong to a story rather than to reality. Other soldiers cited Amadis of Gaul, the popular chivalric romance of the era, as the closest thing they had to a reference point. They were standing in front of something that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. And the wonder was not misplaced. Tenochtitlan, in 1519 was one of the largest cities in the world. Contemporary estimates suggest a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, which would have made it significantly larger than London or Paris at the time, comparable to the great cities of the Ottoman Empire, rivaling perhaps only Constantinople and Beijing among the great urban centres of the era. It had been built on an island in Lake Texcoco, a shallow brackish lake in the high-altitude valley of Mexico, and expanded over 2 centuries through the construction of chinampas, the famous floating gardens, which were not really floating at all but built up from the lake bottom, using layers of mud and vegetation until they became solid enough to build on and farm. The city had been extended into the water itself, turning the lake into a kind of urban infrastructure. 3 great causeways connected the island city to the shore, each wide enough for multiple people to walk abreast, and the lake around them was alive with canoe traffic, thousands of small boats moving goods and people and water. For the lake water was brackish, undrinkable, and fresh water was brought in via aqueduct from springs on the mainland. The engineering required to build and maintain this was sophisticated enough that the Spanish, accustomed to thinking of themselves as representatives of the most advanced civilization in the world, were visibly impressed and somewhat unsettled by it. You could not stand in Tenochtitlan and maintain the comfortable colonial assumption that you were dealing with primitive people. The great temple at the centre of the city, the Templo Mayor, actually a double pyramid dedicated to the sun god Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc, rose above everything, visible from miles away, its summit stained with the evidence of its purpose. The marketplace at Tlatelolco, the twin city on the northern portion of the island, was reportedly larger than any market in Spain, trading in everything from gold and textiles to food and animals and medicines and slaves, organised with a meticulous efficiency that the Spanish consistently noted with something that sounds, in the written accounts, suspiciously like admiration. Moctezuma II, the ruler of this empire, came out to meet the Spanish on a causeway leading into the city. The encounter was one of the great theatrical set pieces of the entire conquest, and both sides understood its performative dimension perfectly. Moctezuma arrived in a litter, carried by noblemen, barefoot nobles clearing the ground before him so that his feet would never touch the earth directly, a practice that indicated divine status. He was dressed in garments of elaborately worked cotton and featherwork, wearing jade and gold, attended by a retinue of lords and warriors. The accounts describe him as of medium height, lean, about 40 years old, with a sparse beard and careful eyes. The eyes, several writers note, of a man who was watching everything at once and calculating constantly. Cortés dismounted, the horse itself a significant gesture, bringing himself to something closer to human scale, and moved to embrace Moctezuma in the Spanish fashion. The Aztec lords physically blocked this contact. The emperor's person was not to be touched. They settled instead on an exchange of gifts and formal speeches, translated through the chain of La Malinche and Aguilar, speeches that were simultaneously diplomatic and ambiguous, each side saying things that could be interpreted in multiple ways, and that each side perhaps heard differently. Moctezuma welcomed the Spanish to his city. Whether this welcome was genuine hospitality, political calculation, religious awe, or some combination of all three is a question that has never been definitively resolved. The Spanish were quarters in the palace of Moctezuma's father, Axayácatl, a large and well-appointed complex near the Templo Mayor, and there they settled in as guests, honoured guests, but also it became increasingly clear guests who were not entirely free to come and go as they pleased. The city was magnificent, but it was also a trap, in the sense that any place surrounded by water and connected to the shore by causeways that could be cut at a moment's notice is a trap. Cortés understood this as clearly as Moctezuma did, and the weeks that followed were a delicate and dangerous dance between two men, each of whom was trying to understand the other's intentions without giving away his own. Cortés made the extraordinary decision to take Moctezuma hostage. The exact circumstances and motivations are debated, but the core of the situation was this. The Spanish discovered, or claimed to have discovered, evidence of an attack on their coastal garrison at Veracruz in which several Spanish soldiers had been killed by warriors acting under Aztec authority. Using this as a pretext, Cortés confronted Moctezuma directly, through La Malinche's translation, in a conversation that must have been one of the most extraordinary and terrifying diplomatic exchanges in history, and essentially told the emperor that he would need to come and live in the Spanish quarters as a guarantee of his people's good behaviour. Moctezuma, after hours of negotiation, agreed. The ruler of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica walked across the city to the quarters of 500 foreign soldiers and became their captive. There is no fully satisfying explanation for why he agreed. The power he nominally commanded was vastly greater than anything Cortés could bring to bear. If Moctezuma had given the order, the Spanish would have been overwhelmed in hours. But Moctezuma did not give the order, and in the months that followed, he largely cooperated with his captors, receiving his nobles and conducting his government from within the confines of the Spanish compound, with an air that his people struggled to understand, and that historians have been struggling to explain ever since. Paralysis in the face of an unprecedented threat is one theory. Genuine mystical uncertainty about the nature of the Spanish is another. Political calculation, keeping the foreigners close, managing them, waiting for the right moment, is a third. Perhaps it was all three, shifting in emphasis from day to day, as the situation in the city grew steadily more dangerous. For underneath the surface courtesy of Moctezuma's captivity, Tenochtitlan was becoming frightened and angry. The people could see that their emperor was not free. They could see the Spanish soldiers with their weapons and their horses moving through the streets, their priests tearing down idols and replacing them with crosses, their presumptuous confidence in every space they entered. The tension was building like water behind a dam, and everyone in that city, Spanish and Aztec alike, could feel it building, even if no one could say exactly when or how the dam would break. The city that Cortés's army entered in November of 1519 was organised on a principle that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. Familiar, because every human city organises itself around centres of power and commerce and worship, around the logic of who eats and who works and who commands, and Tenochtitlan was no different in its underlying structure. Foreign, because the specific forms that structure took, the floating gardens, the ritual of the market, the architecture of the temples, the cosmological map embedded in the city's layout, derived from a tradition that had developed entirely independently of anything in European or Asian or African history. The grid of its streets, the system of its canals, the placement of its ceremonial centre, all of it encoded a view of the cosmos and humanity's place in it that was as sophisticated and as internally coherent as anything that European civilization had produced, and simply had nothing to do with it. The market at Tlatelolco, which Cortés and his men visited with something approaching awe, was described in his letters to King Charles in terms that ring with genuine wonder, the wonder of a man whose reference points have been exceeded. He estimated 60,000 buyers and sellers on a busy day. The organisation of goods by category, the presence of officials whose job was to enforce weights and measures, and the rules of exchange, the variety of what was being sold, cacao and cotton and jade and featherwork and slaves and pottery and food in 100 varieties. All of it spoke of an economic life of genuine complexity, a division of labour, and a system of exchange that had been refined over generations. The Spanish word that Cortés and his men kept reaching for was admirable, and they meant it as a factual description, not as flattery. The relationship between Cortés and Moctezuma during the weeks of captivity has been the subject of an enormous amount of speculation, partly because what we know of it comes almost entirely from sources with significant interests in how it was portrayed. The Spanish accounts, written after the conquest, had obvious reasons to portray Moctezuma as cooperative and even welcoming, because this made the conquest seem less like outright aggression, and more like a kind of political transition with the ruler's implicit consent. The indigenous accounts, written and transmitted after the conquest by people who had survived it, had reasons to portray Moctezuma as paralysed or deceived or supernaturally confused, because the alternative, that he made calculated political decisions that turned out badly, was uncomfortable. The truth was probably something that neither tradition found convenient, a ruler operating in circumstances without precedent, making imperfect decisions under impossible pressure, running out of options slowly and then all at once. What we can say with some confidence is that the Spanish presence in Tenochtitlan was, from the beginning, experienced as a desecration. The Spanish soldiers roamed the city's streets with the confidence of conquerors, not the deference of guests. They climbed the Templo Mayor and looked down at the city from the summit with an evaluating gaze that the Aztec nobles found offensive in ways that went beyond the merely political. The priests who accompanied the expedition pushed for the removal of Aztec religious icons from the temple's shrines and their replacement with Christian imagery, and while Cortés restrained this impulse somewhat, he did not restrain it entirely, and the sight of a cross installed in a place that held the sacred objects of a civilization's relationship with its gods was not a sight that could be absorbed without consequence. The crisis, when it came from an unexpected direction. In the spring of 1520, Cortés received word that a substantial Spanish force had landed on the Gulf Coast. This was the force that Diego Velázquez had finally managed to assemble and dispatch, commanded by a man named Pánfilo de Narváez, and its mission was explicit. Find Cortés, arrest him, bring him back to Cuba to face justice for his defiance of the governor. Narváez had somewhere between 800 and 1,200 men with him, significantly more than Cortés's force, and he had artillery and horses and the legal authority of the governor of Cuba behind him. The timing could not have been worse. The situation in Tenochtitlan was already precarious, with Moctezuma's authority visibly compromised and the Aztec nobles growing increasingly restless. And now Cortés had to leave the city, had to leave it in the hands of his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado, to deal with what was, in practical terms, a more immediate threat to his life than the Aztec warriors surrounding him. He took most of his men and marched back to the coast. What followed was a demonstration of the kind of audacious military improvisation that defines Cortés's reputation. Rather than waiting for Narváez to come to him, or attempting diplomatic negotiation through official channels, Cortés launched a surprise night attack on Narváez's camp. It was a tactic he had clearly thought through carefully. Narváez's larger force would be at a disadvantage in darkness. The element of surprise would compensate for the numerical disadvantage, and, crucially, Cortés had been sending messages to Narváez's men ahead of the battle, offering them gold and promises if they switched sides, making the case that the real adventure was inland with him, not on the coast executing Velázquez's revenge. He had been, in other words, both military commander and recruiting officer simultaneously. The night attack worked almost perfectly. Narváez himself was captured early in the fighting, reportedly losing an eye to a pike thrust, and with their commander down, the large force he had brought from Cuba largely chose the option that Cortés had been quietly selling them for weeks. They joined him. In a single night, Cortés absorbed an army that had been sent to destroy him and nearly doubled the size of his own force. It was the kind of reversal that legends are made of, and it would have been the high point of his career if the news waiting for him from Tenochtitlan had not been catastrophic. Pedro de Alvarado, left in command of the Spanish garrison and the Aztec capital while Cortés was away, had committed a massacre. During a major religious festival, the Festival of Toxcatl, one of the most important celebrations in the Aztec calendar, attended by hundreds of the empire's most prominent nobles, warriors, and priests, gathered in a ceremonial space near the Great Temple, Alvarado had ordered an attack. The Spanish soldiers fell on the assembled crowd with swords. The accounts describe an enclosed space, no exits, people dressed in ceremonial finery with no weapons, and the methodical killing of somewhere between 600 and 1,000 of the Aztec elite. Why Alvarado did this has been debated ever since. The Spanish accounts claim they had intelligence of a planned attack on the garrison and were acting preemptively. The indigenous accounts are consistent that there was no such plan, that the festival was purely religious, and that what happened was unprovoked slaughter. The historical consensus leans toward the indigenous accounts, partly because Alvarado's pattern of behaviour throughout the campaign was one of impulsive violence with minimal strategic calculation, and partly because the massacre makes no strategic sense. It accomplished nothing except to destroy the relationship between the Spanish and the Aztec population that Moctezuma's cooperation had been, however uneasily, maintaining. The city erupted. The Aztec nobility, the very class that had been absorbing the humiliation of their emperor's captivity with bitter patience, was now committed to war. Moctezuma, whom Cortés had counted on as a tool for managing the city's anger, was brought out onto the roof of the Spanish compound to address his people and urge calm. The accounts of what happened next differ in the details but agree on the outcome. The crowd below turned on their emperor. Whether they threw stones and darts at him, or whether he died of other causes in Spanish captivity shortly after, Moctezuma was dead within days. The tool Cortés had been using to manage the empire was gone. Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan, fought his way into the city at considerable cost, reunited with the garrison, and immediately grasped the scale of the disaster. The city was hostile. The population was fighting. The causeways could be cut. The Spanish had more men now, with Narvaez's army absorbed, but they were surrounded in a city of hundreds of thousands of furious people, their hostage dead, their supplies uncertain, and their position, for the first time in the campaign, genuinely, comprehensively hopeless. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortés ordered a retreat. The army would attempt to leave the city in darkness, cross the causeway to the shore and escape. They loaded what gold they could carry. They prepared makeshift bridges for the gaps in the causeway. The Aztecs had removed sections to prevent exactly this kind of escape. They moved as quietly as hundreds of soldiers and horses and thousands of indigenous allies could move, which was not quietly enough. The alarm was raised. The lake came alive with canoes. Aztec warriors blocked the causeway ahead and attacked from the water on both sides. The fighting in the darkness, on a narrow elevated causeway over black water, with people falling and horses screaming and the gold too heavy to run with, was a massacre of a different kind. By the time the survivors reached the shore, somewhere between 400 and 800 Spanish soldiers were dead, roughly a third to half of the European force, along with thousands of Tlaxcalan allies, almost all the horses, nearly all the artillery, and most of the gold that had been extracted from Tenochtitlan. Cortés himself, according to several accounts, sat down under a large tree at the edge of the city and wept. History records this night as the Noche Triste, the night of sorrow. It is one of the most complete military disasters in the history of the conquest, and it should, by all reasonable reckoning, have been the end of the story. The expedition was shattered. The men were traumatized. The supplies were gone. The great alliance with the Aztec leadership was irreparably broken. The Spanish were back on the shore of Mexico with nothing but their lives and their wounds and whatever pride could be salvaged from a rout. But Cortés had no ships to sail away in. He had burned them the year before. The Noche Triste was not simply a military disaster. It was a psychological rupture of the kind that sometimes breaks men and sometimes reveals what they are made of. The soldiers who survived the causeway fight carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. The darkness and the screaming and the horses falling into the water and the weight of the gold pulling men down as they tried to cross gaps in the causeway on improvised bridges of debris and bodies. Bernal Diaz, writing decades later, still conveys the quality of that night in prose that has the texture of trauma, flat and specific, the details too precise to be anything other than the memory of someone who was actually there. The death of Moctezuma remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions of the conquest. The Spanish accounts say he was stoned by his own people while speaking to them from the roof of the Spanish compound, dying of his wounds days later. Several indigenous accounts say he was killed by the Spanish before the retreat, either strangled or stabbed, his death covered up with a story of popular anger that served the Spanish interest in not being seen as the murderers of a major ruler. The truth is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that by the time the Spanish were fighting their way across the causeway, in the darkness of the Noche Triste, Moctezuma was already dead, and with him went whatever remained of the possibility of a negotiated settlement that left the Spanish as the dominant power, but left Aztec political structures nominally intact. That possibility had probably been gone for some time, but his death made it official. The days immediately following the Noche Triste saw a quality of leadership from Cortés that, whatever one thinks of the larger enterprise, was genuinely remarkable. He had just watched a third of his army die in a single night, had lost nearly all, his artillery and most of his horses, had seen the carefully constructed political architecture of the Aztec alliance collapse, and was now leading a broken, demoralized army through hostile territory toward the only friendly territory available, with Aztec forces pursuing, and the knowledge that Tenochtitlan, the prize, the whole point of everything, was for the moment beyond his reach. He reportedly spent very little time in anything that looked like despair. He was already analyzing. He was already calculating what was left and what it could do and what the next step was. The weeks after the Noche Triste were some of the most remarkable in the entire campaign, and they reveal something about the nature of Hernán Cortés that the drama of the burning ships and the grandeur of Tenochtitlan can sometimes obscure. He was not just bold. He was genuinely, operationally, systematically capable. In the aftermath of a catastrophe that would have ended most military careers and most military campaigns, he turned the situation around with a clarity and a deliberateness that suggests either exceptional mental resilience or a kind of emotional compartmentalization that would concern us if we thought about it too hard. The immediate problem was survival. The remnant of the Spanish force retreated northeast toward Tlaxcala, fighting a running battle against pursuing Aztec forces. On the plains of Otumba, a few days after the Noche Triste, they faced a large Aztec army that had been assembled specifically to finish them off. The Battle of Otumba, fought on July 7, 1520, was another engagement where the Spanish were badly outnumbered, exhausted, and wounded. What saved them was the same tactical insight that had served Cortés repeatedly. He identified the commander of the Aztec force, identified him by his distinctive feathered standard, the symbol of command that meant the battle itself, and personally led a cavalry charge directly at him. The commander was killed, the standard fell, and by the conventions of Mesoamerican warfare, in which the fall of a commander's standard signaled the battle's end, the Aztec force broke. The Spanish limped into Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans, to their enormous credit and at no small risk to themselves, did not abandon the alliance when the Spanish arrived battered and depleted and missing most of their equipment. The alliance held because it was genuinely mutual. The Tlaxcalans' interest in the defeat of the Aztec Empire had not evaporated because the Spanish had suffered a setback. If anything, the weakness of the Spanish made the political situation more complex and interesting. It would now require a real coalition effort, a genuine joint campaign, rather than simply attaching themselves to an apparently unstoppable European military force. The Tlaxcalans understood something that the Spanish would not fully appreciate until they had processed what happened on the causeway. This was going to be their War II. Cortés spent the rest of 1520 rebuilding, recruiting and preparing for what he had decided would be a systematic and final campaign to take Tenochtitlan. He gathered the survivors of the Noche Triste, incorporated the men he had won from Narvaez, received additional volunteers who arrived from Cuba and the Caribbean as word of the strange campaign circulated among the Spanish colonies, and continued the alliance building among the peoples of central Mexico. He also conceived an idea that was either brilliant or insane, depending on your risk tolerance. He would build a fleet of brigantines, small, shallow draft warships, carry them in pieces over the mountains and reassemble them on Lake Texcoco. The lake that made Tenochtitlan an impregnable island fortress was about to become the means of its destruction. The brigantines were designed and built largely through the efforts of a ship's carpenter named Martin Lopez, and they were constructed during the winter of 1520 to 1521 in Tlaxcala, with thousands of Tlaxcalan workers providing labour. 12 ships, pre-cut and numbered and ready for assembly. They were then carried over the mountains on the backs of an army of porters, the parts of 12 ships, iron fittings and planks and masts and rigging, transported by hand through mountain passes, in one of the great logistical feats of the era. When they reached Lake Texcoco and were assembled and launched in the spring of 1521, they immediately established naval superiority on the lake that no amount of Aztec canoe power could overcome. Cortés had turned the lake from a protection into a liability. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in earnest in May of 1521 and lasted approximately 75 days. The city's new emperor was Cuauhtémoc, a young noble of about 25 who had taken power after Moctezuma's death, and who was, by all accounts, a far more decisive and resolute leader than his predecessor in the circumstances of siege, warfare. Cuauhtémoc organized the defense of the city with genuine skill, using the urban terrain with tactical sophistication, fighting street by street and building by building, using every night to repair the damage inflicted during the day, designing ambushes that took full advantage of the causeways and canals that the Spanish had to cross again and again to advance. The Spanish and their allies, Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, and warriors from dozens of other peoples who had decided to join the winning side, pushed the Aztec defenders back slowly, with enormous casualties. The fighting was close and brutal, nothing like the open field engagements where Spanish cavalry and guns had their maximum effect. It was house-by-house fighting in a city that its defenders knew intimately, and its attackers were learning in blood. The Spanish made a policy of demolishing every building they took, both to prevent reoccupation and to give their cavalry room to operate, and the magnificent city, that had struck the soldiers dumb at the mountain pass began to be systematically dismantled in the process of being conquered. Disease was doing work that neither army fully understood or could have described accurately at the time. The smallpox epidemic that had been spreading through Mexico since the Spanish first arrived, carried by enslaved Africans in Narvaez's fleet, according to most accounts, had struck Tenochtitlan with devastating effect during the fall of 1520, killing the emperor who followed Moctezuma, Cuitlahuac, just months after he took power. The disease spread through a population with no immunity, killing not just soldiers, but nobles and priests and farmers and children, destabilizing the social structures that maintained the defense and the supply of the city's population. By the time the siege was in its final weeks, the city was not just militarily pressured, but hollowed out by sickness and starvation. The water supply had been cut. The causeways were controlled by the Spanish and their allies, meaning food and fresh water could no longer enter the city. The brigantines controlled the lake, preventing resupply or evacuation by canoe. The defenders were fighting on empty stomachs, drinking contaminated water, burying their dead in the ruins of their own buildings. And still they fought. The tenacity of the Aztec defense during those final weeks, against odds that any rational military calculation would have deemed hopeless, is one of the genuinely extraordinary things about this story, and one of the things that tends to get lost in the narrative of conquest as a story of European triumph. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape the city by canoe. He was intercepted by one of the brigantines, captured and brought before Cortés. The meeting between the two men, as recorded in the Spanish accounts, has a gravity and a sadness that even the victors seem to feel. Cuauhtémoc reportedly touched the hilt of Cortés's dagger and asked to be killed. Cortés did not oblige. The young emperor would live for 4 more years, tortured at one point, burned on his feet with a companion in an attempt to extract information about where Aztec gold had been hidden, before being hanged in 1525 on a later expedition to Honduras on charges of treason that most historians regard with skepticism. When the fighting ended and the silence finally fell on what had been Tenochtitlan, there was very little of the city left to look at. The greatest urban centre in the Western Hemisphere had been reduced to rubble, its canals clogged with debris and bodies, its gardens destroyed, its temple torn down. The brigantines sat on a lake that was slowly being drained and filled in, the water retreating from a city that would be rebuilt on top of the ruins, eventually becoming Mexico City, the capital of a country that is still working out what it means to have been born from such a catastrophe. The construction and transport of the brigantines over the mountains to Lake Texcoco stands as one of the great logistical achievements of the entire early modern period, and it tends to be underappreciated in the historical narrative precisely because its complexity is difficult to visualize from the distance of 5 centuries. Martin Lopez, the shipwright who designed and oversaw the construction, worked with Tlaxcalan carpenters and porters to produce 12 shallow draft vessels whose components, pre-cut and numbered for assembly, were then carried through mountain passes by teams of indigenous workers over several days of marching. The iron hardware came from cannons that had been melted down. The pitch for caulking came from local sources that had to be identified and processed. The sails were sewn from whatever canvas was available. Every single component of a naval construction operation that would normally happen in a shipyard with access to a harbour was accomplished in the mountains of central Mexico with improvised tools and materials. The final siege of Tenochtitlan is one of the great military operations of the early modern period, and its scale is often undersold in popular accounts because the popular image of the conquest focuses on the drama of individual encounters. Cortés and Moctezuma face to face, the burning ships, the Noche Triste, rather than on the grinding, systematic coalition military operation that actually destroyed the Aztec state. The force that surrounded Tenochtitlan in the spring of 1521 numbered in the tens of thousands, the vast majority of them indigenous warriors from Tlaxcala and other allied peoples. The Spanish provided the military direction, the naval capability of the brigantines, the firearms and the horses, but the human substance of the siege was Mesoamerican, and the fall of the city was as much an indigenous military achievement as a Spanish one. The courage of Cuauhtémoc in the face of what must have been obvious defeat raises questions that history has not fully answered. He organized the defense of a dying city, maintained the resistance of a population that was dying of smallpox and starvation and thirst, while being systematically killed by an overwhelming coalition force, and continued fighting even when the outcome was not in doubt, even when the political and military logic of surrender was overwhelming. The interpretation of this is culturally loaded. The Spanish accounts tend to portray it as stubbornness or desperation. The Mexican nationalist tradition tends to portray it as noble resistance, the last stand of a civilization that deserved better. Both are probably partially right. What is undeniable is that Cuauhtémoc's resistance extended the siege by weeks and cost both sides enormous casualties, and that this terrible prolonging of the inevitable was, in a way, the final statement of a civilization that refused to simply step aside. The ecological and demographic consequences of the conquest continued to unfold for a century after the fall of Tenochtitlan, and they were on a scale that contemporary observers could not fully comprehend, and that we still struggle to hold in the mind. The diseases that the Spanish carried, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others, moved through indigenous populations with a speed and lethality that had no precedent in human history. Communities that had never encountered these pathogens had no immunological response to them, and the mortality rates in some areas exceeded 80 or 90% within a generation. Entire languages disappeared. Entire agricultural traditions were lost. The knowledge encoded in the priestly and noble classes who died in the siege and its aftermath, astronomical, botanical, medical, historical knowledge accumulated over centuries, was, in many cases, simply gone, never to be recovered. In the months between the fall of Tenochtitlan in August of 1521 and the first serious efforts to build something new on its ruins, there was a period of quiet that is difficult to characterize, and that the historical sources handle with a kind of collective unease. The silence after a great destruction has a particular quality. It is not peaceful. It is the silence of things that are no longer there. The silence of a city that had 10,000 conversations in its streets every hour of the day and now has none. The conquerors moved through the rubble-making inventories. The surviving Aztec nobles sat in what remained of their houses and tried to understand what had happened to the world they had been born into. The allied indigenous warriors from Tlaxcala and elsewhere began the long journey home, carrying wounds and stories. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Hernán Cortés sat down to write a letter to the King of Spain. The third letter, as it is known in the sequence, of Cortés's formal dispatches to the crown, is one of the more remarkable documents in the literature of conquest, not because it tells the truth, it does not entirely, as no such document could, but because of the quality of attention it brings to the task of explaining an unprecedented situation to a distant authority that had no real frame of reference for it. Cortés describes the fall of the city with a precision that feels at times almost clinical, and then shifts register to describe what he intends to build on its ruins with a visionary confidence that is either inspirational or chilling depending on your politics. He's already thinking about the cathedral that will be built on the site of the temple. He's already thinking about the governance structure that will manage the new territories. He's already, in other words, past the event and into the future, in a way that the people whose world had just ended around him were not yet able to be. The indigenous peoples, who survived the fall of Tenochtitlan, entered a world that was in some ways even more disorienting than the siege itself, because the siege at least had the clarity of being a crisis with defined sides and defined stakes. What followed was something more ambiguous, a colonial order that was still defining its own rules, that offered some protections and imposed enormous burdens, that absorbed some indigenous practices and violently suppressed others, that converted people to Christianity with varying degrees of coercion and varying degrees of genuine persuasion, that rebuilt the city's physical infrastructure using indigenous labour, while erasing or covering the physical evidence of indigenous history wherever it was found. The great friars who came to New Spain in the years after the conquest, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, brought with them a genuine commitment to the salvation of indigenous souls that coexisted uncomfortably with the brutal economic exploitation of the encomienda system and with the cultural destruction that accompanied the suppression of indigenous religion. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who arrived in 1529, spent decades working with indigenous informants to compile a comprehensive record of Aztec culture and history, the Florentine Codex, a 12-volume encyclopedic survey that remains one of our most important sources on pre-conquest life. He was trying to understand what had been lost even as the institutional church was finishing the process of losing it. The impulse to record and the impulse to erase existed in the same people at the same time, and the tension between them produced a documentary record that is invaluable and incomplete in equal measure. The great question that hangs over the conquest, the one that no amount of historical analysis can definitively answer, is the counterfactual. What would have happened without it? The Aztec Empire was not a stable system. It had been expanding for 2 centuries and generating resentments at the rate at which empires always generate resentments. The tribute burden was increasing, the flower wars were becoming more frequent and more costly, and the political strains within the Triple Alliance itself were real and growing. It is possible to imagine a Mexico in which internal pressures eventually produced revolt and reconstruction, without Spanish intervention, a Mexico in which the peoples the Aztecs had subjugated found their own path to a different political order. It is also entirely possible that the Aztec state would have continued and evolved and eventually encountered European contact in a very different political configuration, one in which the concentrated resentments that Cortés exploited were not available to be exploited. We will never know. History does not run controlled experiments. What we know is the history that actually happened. A world in which the Spanish arrived at exactly the moment of maximum Aztec political vulnerability, in which a man of unusual ability and ruthlessness understood how to exploit that vulnerability with a coalition of the empire's own subjects, in which the catastrophic intervention of epidemic disease created a mortality that no army on either side fully understood, and in which the result was a transformation so total and so violent that it reset the civilizational trajectory of an entire hemisphere. That is the history. It does not resolve cleanly into a story of heroism or a story of genocide, not because those descriptions are incorrect. Elements of both are present, but because the complexity of what happened exceeds the capacity of any single narrative frame to hold it all at once. And then there is the ongoing story, the 500 years of Mexico that followed, the revolutions and the colonialism and the independence and the nationalism and the murals of Diego Rivera, in which the conquest is depicted with a fury and a beauty that only a people who carry something in their bones can produce. The story did not end in 1521 any more than it began in 1519. The burning of the ships was a chapter, not a conclusion, in a story that is still being written, in Spanish and Nahuatl and English, and the dozens of indigenous languages that are still spoken in Mexico today by people who are, in the most literal sense, the descendants of everything that happened on both sides of that Causeway's fight in the darkness of a June night 5 centuries ago. History rarely delivers clean verdicts, and the history of Hernán Cortés is a place where clean verdicts go to become complicated. He returned to Spain in 1528, nearly a decade after he had first sailed from the Cuban harbour, with a commission that was already being revoked, and the reception he received was itself a study in ambiguity. Charles I, the same Charles who was simultaneously Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, inheritor of the largest empire in European history, met with Cortés and confirmed his titles and holdings in New Spain, but did not make him governor. That role went to a bureaucrat. Cortés was given the title of Marqués del Valle de Oaxaca, which was impressive on paper and which came with enormous landholdings, but it was a title that kept him in the domain of wealth and status without giving him administrative power. The crown was not interested in having a man of Cortés's particular qualities anywhere near the levers of governance. He made 2 more expeditions, one to the Baja California Peninsula in the 1530s, which was a practical failure, and one at sea where he participated poorly in a campaign against Algerian pirates in 1541, and spent years in legal battles with the Spanish colonial administration over his rights and revenues, the same bureaucratic machinery that he had outmaneuvered so brilliantly in his youth, having calcified around him in his age. He died in 1547 near Seville at the age of 62, still pursuing legal claims against the crown, still writing letters arguing for the recognition he believed he deserved. The man who had burned his ship so that his men would have no choice but to go forward died in a kind of backward-looking litigiousness that is either poignant or fitting, depending on how you look at it. The world that Cortés had set in motion continued without him, in ways he could not have fully anticipated. The conquest of Mexico opened a flood of Spanish colonization across the Americas that within a century had transformed the entire Western Hemisphere. The silver mines of Mexico and Peru generated wealth that flowed into Spain, and from Spain into the global economy in quantities that reshaped European finance accelerated the development of capitalism, and funded wars and art and exploration on a scale that would not have been possible without them. The demographic catastrophe of the indigenous populations, the diseases and the forced labour and the cultural destruction that followed conquest, was of a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Some estimates suggest that the indigenous population of central Mexico fell from perhaps 20 million in 1519 to barely 1 million by 1600. Those numbers represent a human catastrophe of a magnitude that dwarfs almost anything else in recorded history. The culture that came after the conquest was not the Aztec Empire, but it was not Spain either. It was something new, the mestizo culture of Mexico, the blend of indigenous and European and eventually African peoples and languages and foods and beliefs that became, over centuries, distinctively Mexican. The corn and chocolate and tomatoes and chili peppers that Cortés's men encountered in the markets of Tenochtitlan are now the staple foods of the planet. The languages and stories and astronomical knowledge and botanical knowledge of the peoples the Spanish conquered entered the global stream of human civilization in ways that continue to enrich it. History is terrible at sorting these things into neat categories of gain and loss, and perhaps that is as it should be. The texture of consequence is always more complicated than the drama of the event. Cortés himself became, over the centuries, a figure onto whom Mexicans and Spaniards and historians and ideologues have projected a remarkable range of meanings. To 19th century Mexican nationalists building a new country that needed a founding mythology, he was the villain of the piece, the destroyer, the foreigner who ended a civilization. The statue of him that once stood in Mexico City was removed. His bones, which had been interred in a Mexican church, were moved to a secret location by Mexican authorities in the 1940s out of concern that nationalist anger might lead to their desecration. To the Spanish colonial tradition, he was a hero of the faith and of the empire, the soldier who brought Christianity to millions and added fabulous wealth to the crown. To historians, trying to see him whole, he was something more uncomfortable and more interesting. A man of his time and yet somehow larger than his time, possessed of qualities that were real and remarkable, even as they were deployed in the service of purposes that resulted in enormous human suffering. And then there is the metaphor. The burning of the ships has escaped its historical context and become something that lives in the language of motivation and decision-making and commitment in a way that no other act from the conquest has managed. Business schools teach it, psychologists cite it, military strategists reference it, self-help books invoke it with varying levels of accuracy. The core idea that commitment sometimes requires the elimination of alternatives, that the psychology of retreat undermines the psychology of advance, that burning your way back can unlock something essential in human determination, has proven to be one of those observations that resonates across centuries and cultures because it touches something true about how human beings actually work. The research on what psychologists call commitment devices, actions taken in advance that make future backsliding harder or impossible, consistently shows that they work, that human beings who burn their ships, metaphorically, are more likely to achieve difficult goals than those who leave themselves an easy exit. We put our money in accounts we cannot touch until retirement. We tell our friends about the diet we're starting, making it harder to quietly abandon it. We sign contracts with deadlines and penalties. We burn ships in 1,000 small ways every time we make a commitment that we want to take seriously, every time we recognize that our future self will be tempted to take the easy path unless our present self makes the easy path unavailable. Cortés understood this, whether consciously or instinctively, and he applied it on a scale and with a directness that makes it impossible to miss. The smoke from those ships on the beach at Veracruz rose and dissipated, and the ships themselves dissolved into the warm water of the Gulf, and nothing remained of them except the idea, which has proved to be the most durable part of the whole enterprise. La Malinche occupies a different and more troubled place in historical memory. For centuries she was cast in the role of traitor, la chingada, the violated one, the indigenous woman who helped the foreigner conquer her own people, and the Mexican term malinchismo came to mean a preference for the foreign over the domestic, a kind of national self-betrayal. But more recent scholarship, and more recent cultural reclamation, have pushed back on this framing with considerable force. She was a woman who had been sold into slavery by her own family, who found herself at the intersection of two civilizations, and who navigated that intersection with extraordinary skill in circumstances that offered very little in the way of good choices. She was not a traitor to a nation because there was no nation, only an empire that had subjugated her people. She was an agent who made decisions under constraint, as human beings always do, and who deserves to be seen in her complexity rather than reduced to a symbol. The Tlaxcalans, whose alliance made the entire conquest logistically possible, occupy an equally ambivalent position in the retrospective history. They were not naive pawns in a Spanish game. They were sophisticated political actors who made a calculation about their own interests and pursued it effectively. They won their freedom from Aztec domination and received from the Spanish crown significant concessions and protections that lasted for generations. They were exempt from certain taxes, they received noble status, they preserved many of their traditions, and they helped destroy the most powerful indigenous political order in the hemisphere, a fact that their descendants would live with in ways the Tlaxcalan nobles of 1521 could not fully have foreseen. Tenochtitlan itself is not entirely gone. Mexico City is built on its bones. When construction workers dig foundations in the city centre, they regularly uncover Aztec artifacts, the material remnants of the civilization that once stood there. Carved stones, pottery, ritual objects, the remains of temples. In 1978, electrical workers digging near the Mexico City Cathedral struck a massive carved disc depicting the dismembered moon goddess Coyolxauhqui, which led to an archaeological excavation that eventually uncovered the remains of the Templo Mayor itself, directly beneath the streets of the modern city. The temple, where tens of thousands of people were sacrificed over the course of the Aztec Empire's history, sits under a few meters of city, still there, still being excavated, still yielding objects that tell us things about a civilization that was destroyed before it could fully tell its own story. The cathedral that the Spanish built on and around the ruins of the temple is itself sinking slowly and unevenly into the drained lake bed that the city was built on, the soft soil compressing under the weight of 5 centuries of construction, the building tilting slightly with each decade that passes. The stone of the cathedral came from the stones of the temple. The city sits atop the city. The history sits beneath the history. And all of it, the Aztec cosmology and the Spanish theology, and the indigenous resistance and the colonial exploitation, and the 5 centuries of Mexican culture that emerged from the collision of all those forces, is present simultaneously in the air above the Zócalo, the great central plaza of Mexico City, where you can stand on any given afternoon and feel, if you're paying attention, the accumulated weight of everything that has happened there. Hernán Cortés never came back to Mexico after his final departure in 1541. He spent his last years in Spain, in the medium, distance between triumph and obscurity that is the fate of so many men who peak early and spectacularly. He had changed the world, and the world had moved on from him, as the world tends to do. The empire he helped build for Spain eventually became an independent nation that made him its villain. The city he destroyed became the capital of a country of over 100 million people. The people he conquered became the ancestors of a culture that has proved far more durable than his own name. And on a beach somewhere that is now a stretch of the Veracruz coast, under however many meters of sand and surf and time, there are the corroded remnants of 11 wooden hulls that he ordered beached and burned and sunk in 1519. The ships that became an idea, the retreat that was never made, the road that only went in one direction, the physical remains of the Aztec Empire that survive in Mexican soil and in the collections of museums around the world give us a partial and fragmentary picture of what was destroyed, and even that partial picture is enough to inspire something like mourning. The featherwork, the elaborate cloaks and headdresses and ritual objects made from the feathers of tropical birds, assembled by craftsmen whose skill and patience and aesthetic sophistication were fully the equal of anything produced in Renaissance Europe, was so fragile that almost none of it survived. The headdress now displayed in Vienna's Museum of Ethnology, attributed to Moctezuma though the attribution is disputed, is one of only a handful of major featherwork objects in existence. It is a stunning object, the green quetzal feathers still vivid after 5 centuries, and it sits in an Austrian museum largely because it was shipped to Europe as a curiosity in the years after the conquest, and was preserved precisely because it was in Europe and not in Mexico. The codices, the books of the Aztec world, painted on folded deerskin or bark paper, recording history and astronomy and ritual and tribute in a visual language of extraordinary complexity, were systematically burned by Spanish priests who saw in them the written record of a religion they were determined to eradicate. Bishop Diego de Landa's burning of the Maya codices in 1562 is the most famous of these cultural destructions, but similar acts occurred throughout Mexico in the years after the conquest. Fewer than 20 pre-Columbian codices survived. The astronomical knowledge they encoded, the historical records they contained, the literary and philosophical tradition they represented, most of it is simply gone. What we know about the Aztec world comes largely from documents produced after the conquest, by indigenous scholars working under Spanish supervision, often trying simultaneously to preserve what they could and to make it acceptable to their overseers, with all the compromises and distortions that such a situation implies. The legacy of the burning of the ships in the cultural memory of military strategy is itself a fascinating story. The phrase entered the European military lexicon as a metaphor for decisive, irreversible commitment, and it was cited, directly or indirectly, in the strategic thinking of commanders for centuries afterward. Alexander the Great had reportedly burned his own fleet at the Indus River, and the parallel between the two stories was drawn explicitly by Renaissance writers who were constructing a tradition of military virtue in which Cortés and Alexander occupied adjacent positions. The comparison was instructive. Both men had pushed beyond the edge of the known world, both had made their retreat impossible in order to force their men's full commitment, and both had changed the shape of the world in ways that outlasted their personal ambitions by millennia. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the metaphor has migrated from military strategy into the language of entrepreneurship and personal development with a fluency that says something about how persistently the underlying psychological insight applies across different domains of human ambition. The venture capitalist who advises founders to burn their ships means something recognizable by the phrase, the idea that maintaining a comfortable fallback, the corporate job you could return to, the business you could pivot back to, the relationship you could re-enter, divides your commitment in ways that make the difficult work of building something genuinely new harder than it needs to be. The research on this, on what behavioral economists call option value, and the psychological costs of maintaining too many options simultaneously, consistently supports the intuition that Cortés was acting on. Options are expensive. The cost of keeping them open is paid in attention and energy and commitment that could otherwise go toward the thing you've actually decided to do. This is not an argument for recklessness. The burning of the ships worked for Cortés because the subsequent situation was genuinely navigable with the resources he had, because the intelligence he had gathered was accurate enough to give him a realistic picture of his prospects, and because the coalition he had built was solid enough to sustain the campaign that followed. Ships that are burned when the situation is truly hopeless just produce a better class of funeral. The genius of Cortés was not the gesture itself, but the judgment that preceded it, the accurate assessment that the situation was difficult but winnable, that the commitment of 500 men to full engagement rather than distracted half-engagement would make the difference between possible and impossible. The burning was the last act of strategic preparation, not an act of desperation. That distinction is everything. The final paradox of Hernán Cortés's life is that the man who made himself impossible to stop by making retreat, impossible was in the end stopped, not by any enemy, but by the system of power that he had served and defied and manipulated and enriched throughout his career. The Spanish crown took what Cortés had delivered to it, and then managed him carefully into irrelevance, granting him titles but not authority, wealth but not power, recognition but not the governing role that his accomplishment arguably demanded. He died in Spain, still writing letters, still arguing his case, still possessed of the same restless argumentative energy that had carried him from Medellin to Tenochtitlan and back. The ships had long since stopped burning. The world he had changed had moved on without him. And the idea of what he had done, the simple, enduring, psychologically resonant idea of a man who burned his way home so that the only possible direction was forward, had already escaped the particulars of his biography and entered the permanent vocabulary of human aspiration. We have come a long way tonight, from the dry hills of Extremadura to the gold-hung markets of Tenochtitlan, from a young man who was supposed to be a lawyer to an old man who died arguing with bureaucrats about the rewards his younger self had earned. We have walked the causeways and crossed the mountains and stood at the edge of a lake that is no longer there. We have met the woman who translated between worlds, and the emperor who may or may not have believed the world was ending, and the warriors who fought for their homes until the very last moment. We have tried to hold in our minds simultaneously the wonder and the horror of it all, the extraordinary human drama and the extraordinary human cost. History at its best is not a record of victories and defeats, or a ledger of good and evil, though it contains all of those things. History at its best is a record of what human beings have actually done when placed under extraordinary pressure, when faced with choices that have no clean answer, when the world they were born into is changing faster than they can fully understand. The people in this story, Cortés, La Malinche, Moctezuma, Cuauhtémoc, the Tlaxcalan chiefs, the ordinary soldiers on both sides who fought and died in a conflict that was reshaping the world they lived in, all of them were doing something that is, in the end, deeply recognizable. They were trying to navigate an impossible situation with the tools and the knowledge and the character they had. The smoke from the burning ships rose into a sky that was just turning toward morning, catching the light of a sun that was already beginning its arc over the Gulf of Mexico, over a coast that was about to become part of a story that the world is still telling. The men on the beach watched the ships burn, and then they turned around, and in front of them was everything. The jungle and the mountains and the great unknown city shimmering in the interior, and the question of whether what they were about to do was courage or madness, greatness or catastrophe, the future or the end. They marched, and the smoke faded into the blue, and the story went on. Every great decision leaves a mark on the world, and some marks outlast the people who made them by centuries. The smoke from Cortés's ships rose into a Mexican morning 500 years ago and thinned and vanished as smoke always does. But the decision behind it, the recognition that full commitment sometimes requires the elimination of alternatives, that the way forward is sometimes only visible once the way back has been closed, remains as vivid and as instructive and as genuinely true as it was on that beach in 1519. That is how history works at its best. Not as a catalogue of dead events, but as a living conversation between the past and the present, between the choices that were made and the choices that remain to be made. The fire is out, the water is still. Sleep now, and let the story settle into the quiet place where good stories go.